Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. When my dad and I moved into the small apartment, it was supposed to be a temporary solution while our house underwent renovations. We were adjusting to our new surroundings in the apartment complex, which for the most part was pretty quiet. Most of our neighbors kept to themselves and life was uneventful, except for one family that lived a couple of doors down from us. The family consisted of a mother and her two adult children. A son and a daughter, both in their 20s. From the moment we moved in, it was clear that their household was far from peaceful. It seemed like every other day their arguments would spill out into the common areas of the complex. The son, a tall muscular guy with a constant scowl, and his sister, a petite woman with an equally fiery temper, were always at each other's throats. Their mother, a weary-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, often tried to mediate, but her efforts were usually in vain. Despite the frequent disturbances, my dad and I tried to mind our own business. After all, we were only going to be there for a few months, and it didn't seem worth getting involved in someone else's family drama. But all of that changed on one sunny afternoon when the arguments escalated into something far more dangerous. I remember the day vividly. It was a lazy Saturday, and I was in my room, trying to focus on a book I'd been meaning to finish. My dad was in the living room tinkering with some electronics, his favorite pastime. It was the usual sounds of the apartment complex, distant conversations, footsteps, the hum of the appliances providing a comforting background noise. Suddenly, the familiar sound of yelling pierced the tranquility. I sighed and tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another one of their routine arguments. But this time the yelling was different. It was more urgent, more desperate. I put down my book and walked over to the window, curiosity getting the better of me. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The mother and daughter were outside backing away from the building with terrified expressions on their faces. The son was following them, his face twisted in rage, and in his hand, he held a large kitchen knife. He was shouting something unintelligible, but his intentions were clear. "Dad!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. "Come here, quick!" My dad rushed to my side and looked out the window, his eyes widened as he took in the scene. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his phone and bolted for the door. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time we reached the footpath outside, the situation had escalated even further. The son was now only a few feet away from his mother and sister, who were backed up against the wall with nowhere to go. My dad, who had always been a man of action, didn't waste any time. He lunged at the son, grabbing his arm in an attempt to wrestle the knife away. "Call the police," he shouted over his shoulder at me. I fumbled my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. My dad and the son were now locked in a struggle, the knife glinting in the sunlight as they fought for control. The mother and daughter watched in horror, too stunned to move. 911, what's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone. "There's a man with a knife attacking his family. My dad's trying to stop him. We need help now." I blurted out, giving our address as quickly as I could. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I watched in terror as my dad managed to pin the son to the ground, finally prying the knife away from his grasp. The son, surprisingly, didn't really resist much after that. He laid there breathing heavily as my dad yelled at him to stay down, and several police cars screeched to a halt in front of the complex. Officers rushed out, guns drawn, and then quickly took control of the situation. They handcuffed the son and led him away, still seething with anger but not putting up a fight. The mother and daughter then collapsed to the ground, now sobbing with relief. My dad, his face pale and his hands trembling, handed the knife over to one of the officers. I stood there, still clutching my phone, feeling a mixture of fear and admiration for my father's bravery. One of the officers approached us and took our statements. The mother, once she had composed herself enough to speak, explained that her son had severe anger issues. She told us that he had been struggling for years and this wasn't the first time he had become violent. She expressed her gratitude to my dad for stepping in and possibly saving their lives. As the police drove the son away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of uneasiness. What if he came back? What if the situation escalated even further next time? These thoughts swirled in my mind as we returned to our apartment, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. For the next few days, the apartment complex was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of life had been replaced by an eerie silence, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The mother and daughter kept to themselves, rarely leaving their apartment. About a month later, we noticed the son had returned. He looked different, more subdued, almost resigned. The mother had mentioned that he was undergoing treatment, but it was hard to believe that a month away could make such a drastic change. Surprisingly, there were no more arguments or yelling matches. The family seemed to have settled into a fragile peace, and the complex slowly returned to its normal state. But the incident had left a lasting impression on me. It was a stark reminder of how quickly life could change and how important it was to be prepared for the unexpected. As for my dad and I, our bond grew stronger after that day. I had always admired him, but seeing him in action, risking his own safety to protect others, well, it made me realize just how lucky I was to have him. Our time in the apartment was temporary, but the lessons we learned and the experiences we shared during those months would stay with us forever. Eventually, the renovations on our house were completed and it was time to move back home. As we packed up our belongings and prepared to leave the apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The apartment complex, once just a temporary home, had become a place of growth and learning for me. I looked out the window one last time, taking in the familiar view of the footpath and the rows of the connected houses. The memory of that fateful afternoon was still fresh in my mind, but now it was tempered with a sense of resilience and hope. Life was unpredictable, but with my dad by my side, I knew that we could face whatever challenges came our way. As we drove away, I glanced back at the apartment complex, a small smile playing on my lips. It had been a place of turmoil and fear, but also of courage and strength, and I know no matter where life took us next, I would always carry those lessons with me. Ready to face the future with a newfound sense of confidence and determination. My name is Bob and I've been a fan of this channel for a long time. I'm an older viewer, probably a lot older than most. I'm almost 70 years old now, but the story I want to share happened when I was just 10 years old. Back in the summer of '64, I had a job delivering milk around my neighborhood. Yes, I'm that old. It was a quiet suburb with neat lines, picket fences, and cozy homes. Every morning before dawn, I would load up my bicycle with clinking glass bottles and pedal through the serene streets. One thing that set our neighborhood apart, the mysterious Mr. Franklin who lived at the end of Elderberry Lane. His house was an old Victorian with dark curtains always drawn. Rumors said that he rarely came out during the day, preferring the cover of night for his activities. I noticed Mr. Franklin during my third week on the milk route. After leaving milk on Ms. Thompson's doorstep, another local in the neighborhood, I had felt a shiver down my spine. Turning around, I saw him. Mr. Franklin standing in his overgrown garden, his pale face framed by messy gray hair. His unsettling smile made my heart race. From then on, I always felt his eyes on me during my deliveries. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him behind his curtains or see his figure under a street lamp. It seemed that he was always watching but never approaching. As time passed, Mr. Franklin's presence became more real to me. My bike would be moved or I'd hear footsteps behind me in dark alleys. One foggy morning, I saw him standing far away under a street light. A smile directed not at me, but something behind me. A chilling sight that made me spin around in fear. Fear became my constant companion. I started taking different routes and avoiding quiet corners where Mr. Franklin might be lurking. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. While one really hot afternoon, seeking refuge from the heat in an abandoned warehouse, I overheard two men talking about Mr. Franklin. They spoke in hushed tones, warning each other about his collection of photos and letters about people in our neighborhood, more specifically, some of the children in the neighborhood. They said he watched everyone closely and they needed to keep an eye on me. Well, I couldn't sleep at all later that night. The thought of Mr. Franklin's obsession with collecting information about us gave me the chills. Finally determined to confront him, I set out on my milk route at dawn the next morning. Paddling down Elderberry Lane, I gathered my courage and knocked on his door. "Come on in, boy." Mr. Franklin's voice called from inside in a tone of kindness, but also menacing at the same time. Mentally preparing myself, I entered his house. The air inside smelled musty from old books, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with files neatly labeled with names of people that I knew from the neighborhood. Mr. Franklin sat at a cluttered desk beneath a dusty chandelier. His smile when he turned to face me was eerie, yet there was a hint of anticipation in his eyes. "You've been watching me," I accused, my voice trembling. Mr. Franklin's smile widened. "Just watching you, my boy. I watched them all," he said, gesturing to the files around us. He explained that he was an observer, a collector of stories and lives, trying to understand and capture the essence of what it meant to be alive. His words carried a strange longing, a desire to connect with lives passing him by unnoticed. At this point, I was absolutely horrified and I wanted out of his house immediately. But curiosity got the best of me. "Why?" I managed to ask, struggling to grasp his obsession. Mr. Franklin looked at me with a mix of disappointment and resignation. "I want to know, to understand," he said softly, "to possess something of the lives that surround me." With a newfound resolve, I declared that I wouldn't be part of his collection. Mr. Franklin nodded sadly, and with a wave of his hand, he allowed me to leave. Walking away from Elderberry Lane that morning, I felt relieved yet haunted by the weight of Mr. Franklin's gaze. Over the years the neighborhood changed, replaced by modern streets and buildings, but the memory of Mr. Franklin and his unsettling obsession remained etched into my mind, a reminder of how darkness can hide beneath ordinary facades. Though I've moved on and built a different life for myself, there are nights when I find myself staring into the darkness, half expecting to see Mr. Franklin's figure with that unsettling smile. Let me share a story that really shook me up after everything I've been through. I'm a 32-year-old tall guy, over 6 feet and around 180 pounds. Recently I've been dealing with a tough divorce. My wife moved out and I had decided to put our house up for sale. I moved into a new apartment to start fresh, trying to keep safe after a violent attack that I suffered, and I'm still not in the best shape. For safety, I haven't changed my address officially. My mail goes to a P.O. box instead. It's a precaution that I took seriously. One evening, I was at home on my couch flipping through TV channels while watching baseball. It was almost 8 p.m. and I wasn't expecting visitors. None of my friends had mentioned stopping by. When the doorbell rang, I ignored it at first, keeping the volume low on the TV. But after about 5 minutes, the doorbell rang again. I cautiously got up, trying not to make the floor creak too loudly. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a petite woman in her mid-20s standing outside. She looked innocent enough, but I didn't recognize her. I decided to be cautious and keep the chain on when I opened the door. She greeted me by my name and held a papaya, introducing herself as Alicia from apartment C2, which was just across the hall and a bit to the right. I looked at her door and then back at her, hesitating before undoing the chain. Taking the papaya, I asked how she knew my name. With a giggle, she explained that my mail had ended up in her mailbox by mistake. She then waved an envelope in front of me, a personal letter addressed to me at my new address. I took it, still feeling skeptical. I hadn't seen her around before, though I knew the guy who lived in C2. She giggled again, mentioning that she had just moved in, and extended her hand out for a handshake. Normally I give a firm shake, but this time I admit it was weak. She grinned widely, speaking a bit louder. "Nice to meet you, neighbor," and then stared directly into my eyes. After waving goodbye, instead of going back to her own apartment, she headed toward the elevator. I tossed the papaya and opened the letter. It was unsigned and didn't contain anything relevant except my name and new address. I felt a bit creeped out, but I wonder if I was overreacting. What do you guys think? Our family moved into a cozy house in a decent neighborhood in a nice suburban area when I was 9 years old. It was a peaceful neighborhood with friendly neighbors, except for one house that always seemed a bit off. Nathan lived in the house next door. He was in his late 40s, always wore the same faded denim overalls, and had a crooked smile that made me uneasy. Nathan was friendly at first, often waving and trying to strike up conversations with my parents whenever they were outside gardening. He had a wiry build and dark bushy hair that always looked unkempt. As time passed, Nathan's behavior started to become more peculiar. He would linger at the edge of our property, staring at our house for long periods without saying a word. Sometimes I would catch him watching me play in the backyard, his eyes following my every move. It made me feel uncomfortable, like I was being watched by a predator. One day my mom found a note tucked under our doormat. It was written in messy handwriting, saying how much Nathan liked our family and how he wanted to be our friend. The note made my mom feel uneasy, but she just brushed it off as Nathan just being lonely. Things took a darker turn when Nathan started leaving strange gifts on our doorstep. On one occasion it was a dead bird wrapped in newspaper. Another time it was a broken doll with missing limbs. Each gift sent shivers down our spines, and we began locking our doors and windows at all times. Nathan's visits became more frequent and unpredictable. He would knock on our door late at night, claiming that he needed to borrow something trivial like a cup of sugar or a book that he knew we didn't have. Sometimes he would just stand outside our house, staring silently at our windows. My parents tried talking to Nathan's family about his odd behavior, but they seemed indifferent, saying Nathan was harmless and just had issues. They hinted that Nathan had a mental disorder, but didn't go into the details. It became clear that Nathan's family was either unable or unwilling to control him. One evening I was playing in the front yard when Nathan approached me with a wide grin. He had started asking strange questions about my family and where I went to school. His eyes had a wild look, and I could tell something wasn't right. I ran inside and told my parents, who immediately called the police. The police spoke to Nathan and his family, but said they couldn't do much unless Nathan posed a direct threat. They advised us to keep documenting his behavior and to call them immediately if things escalated. Weeks had passed without incident, and we finally started to relax a bit, thinking maybe Nathan had finally moved on. But on one stormy night, we heard a loud crash coming from Nathan's house. My dad went outside to investigate, and he found Nathan standing in the middle of his living room, surrounded by shattered glass and broken furniture. He was muttering to himself, and he seemed completely disconnected from reality. We called an ambulance, and Nathan was promptly taken to the hospital. It turned out that he had a severe mental breakdown exacerbated by his untreated mental disorder. The doctor said he needed to be admitted to a psychiatric ward immediately for evaluation and treatment. After Nathan was taken away, there was a sense of relief in our neighborhood. We learned more about Nathan's condition, and we realized that he had been struggling for years without proper care or supervision. His family eventually sold the house and moved away, leaving behind a community shaken by Nathan's unsettling presence. Looking back, I realize how important it is to take mental health seriously and to seek help for those who may be struggling. Nathan's story taught us compassion and the importance of understanding, even in the face of fear and uncertainty. About 3 years ago, I moved into a duplex with my ex-boyfriend in what we thought was a safer part of the city. One of our neighbors, Sarah, worked in the rental office of the duplex, and her husband Jeff, who had just been released from prison, had been doing landscaping work around the rentals like mowing the lawns, cutting the trees, etc. He spent most of his time at home, tinkering with his mower or truck. At first Rachel and Jeff seemed like kind and friendly people. We even smoked weed together a few times, Jeff more than Sarah, and we also had chats about various things. I really felt safe living next to them, and I trusted them. However, things started to get creepy. I once mentioned to Jeff that I sometimes heard footsteps in the attic above my room when I was home alone, along with the sound of furniture being moved around. It always freaked me out, and I would call someone just to feel safer until the noises finally stopped. Jeff jokingly asked if I thought they were spying on me, but it made me uncomfortable. After my breakup with my boyfriend a few months ago, Jeff began texting me, asking if I wanted to drink with him while Sarah was at work. I always made excuses and declined. Then one day, he asked if I wanted to have sex with him because he thought that Sarah was cheating on him. I shut that down immediately, but it created a tense and awkward situation. I didn't tell Sarah because I didn't want things to get worse or be kicked out of my place. I also hated confrontations, so I kept quiet. Soon after, I started hearing noises in the attic more frequently. It got worse when I heard a loud bang outside my door one night around 3 or 4 a.m. When I checked, I found a small lockpick on the ground. I kept it and texted a picture to Sarah, thinking someone was lurking around. She dismissed it, saying it was Jeff's ice pick, not a lockpick, and then reassured me that no one could pick my deadbolt with it. But I knew the difference between a lockpick and an ice pick. Now I'm terrified to be alone in the duplex, especially at night. Our attics are connected, and I can't shake the feeling that Jeff might be up there spying on me. I even discovered a freshly drilled hole in the ceiling of my room. I stuffed it with paper and just tried not to think about it too much. I hope it's just paranoia and that nothing more will happen. Despite all this, I haven't reported anything to the police because I lack solid evidence. I have the lockpick and pictures of my door being tampered with, but whenever I checked the attic it was empty. I never went in alone because the attic entrance is in my garage, and it requires 2 people to access. By the time my ex-boyfriend arrived when I called him over about the noises, whatever was making them would be gone. I'm really hesitant to report anything without concrete proof. For safety, I've been staying with my current boyfriend until I move out in a few weeks, despite my neighbors being upset about my decision to leave. After that, I stopped hanging out with them, and I only spoke to them when we were both outside together. My name is Tommy, and I live in a small town where everyone knows everyone. We have this neighbor named Dan, who lives down the street from me. Dan's always been a bit weird, but lately, things have gotten really creepy. It started a few weeks ago, when my friend Billy told me that he saw Dan watching him while he was playing basketball in his driveway. Billy said Dan just stood there behind a tree, not saying a word, just staring. That freaked Billy out, so he went inside. Then the other kids in the neighborhood started talking about how they'd see Dan hanging around the park where we all play after school. He'd just sit on a bench and watch us, not doing anything else. It made us all feel really uncomfortable. One day I was riding my bike around the block when I saw Dan's car parked on the side road near the park. He was inside, just sitting there, staring at the kids playing. I felt this cold chill run down my spine, like something wasn't right. I told my mom about it when I got home and she looked really worried. She told me to stay away from Dan and to not go near him if I saw him outside. She said she'd talk to the other parents in the neighborhood to see if they noticed anything strange too. A few days later, my mom told me that some of the other parents had seen Dan following kids home from school. They said that he'd walk behind them at a distance, like he was trying to stay hidden. That made my heart race, because I walk home from school every day. One afternoon as I was walking home, I saw Dan across the street. He was standing behind a tree watching me. I walked faster, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way home. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dan and how he'd been watching us all. I didn't feel safe anymore, even in my own house. The next day, my mom and some of the other parents went to the police about this. They told them about Dan and all the creepy things he had been doing. The police said they'd keep an eye on him and also talk to him to find out what was going on. A few days later, we heard that Dan had been arrested. The police found out that he had a history of doing weird stuff around kids in the other neighborhoods too. They said that he wasn't supposed to be near kids at all. He was a registered sex offender. After that, things finally started to feel normal again in our neighborhood. We could go to the park and play basketball without worrying about Dan watching us and being a weirdo creep. It was a relief knowing that the police were keeping us all safe. But I still think about those days when Dan was watching us. It's scary to think that someone you know could be doing something so creepy. I'm just glad we spoke up and got help before anything bad happened. I've always been good at blending in, at becoming part of the background. It's a skill that served me well over the years, especially now as I watch her, the young woman in apartment 3B. From my vantage point across the courtyard behind the safety of drawn curtains and a partially open window, I observe her daily routines with a mix of fascination and longing. And if by now you couldn't already tell, this is a different kind of story, the one where I'm the creeper. Anyways, she doesn't know me. Not really. To her, I'm just another face in the building, perhaps a neighbor she passes in the hallway or nods to in the elevator. But to me, she is my everything. Her name is Sarah. I learned that from the mailbox one afternoon when I chanced to see her retrieve her mail. Sarah with the easy smile and the infectious laugh that echoes down the corridor on occasion. I know her schedule almost as well as my own. In the mornings, she emerges from her apartment at precisely 7:45, dressed for work in smart blouses and pencil skirts that accentuate her figure. She carries a sleek black briefcase and often stops by the coffee shop on the corner, before then disappearing into the throng of the city's morning rush. I've imagined countless scenarios where our paths might cross naturally, perhaps at the corner cafe where I could strike up a casual conversation about the weather or the latest news, but I know better than to risk the fragile fabric of my carefully constructed reality. No, it's safer to remain in the shadows, to watch and to wait. During the day I occupy myself with mundane tasks, an errand here, a trip to the grocery store there, all the while keeping one ear tuned to the hum of life in the apartment complex. Occasionally, I'll catch glimpses of her through the frosted glass of her kitchen window as she prepares dinner or unwinds after a long day. Nights are the hardest when the silence of the building presses in around me like a suffocating blanket. That's when I find myself drawn to the window, drawn to the faint glow of light from apartment 3B. Sometimes I see her curled up on the couch, with a book held close to her chest. Other times she watches television, the flickering screen casting shadows across her face. I wonder what occupies her thoughts during those quiet moments. Does she think of me, the faceless neighbor who watches her from across the courtyard? Or does she go about life, oblivious to the silent presence that hovers on the periphery of her world? I've tried to rationalize my obsession, to convince myself that it's harmless, that it's merely a passing fascination, but the truth is far more insidious. I can't tear myself away from her, the need to know her, to understand her. It consumes me in ways that I just can't explain. Tonight is no different. As I stand at the window, the darkness outside broken only by the soft glow of streetlights, my gaze inevitably drifts to apartment 3B. I see movement, a flicker of movement that draws me closer to the glass, my breath fogging the window pane. She's there, framed against the lamplight from the living room, her silhouette ethereal and distant. There's a vulnerability about her in these moments, a rawness that she only reveals when she thinks no one's watching. And yet I'm watching. I'm always watching. Suddenly she turns, as if sensing my gaze, from across the courtyard. My heart lurches in my chest, and for a fleeting instant, our eyes meet through the glass. Panic surges through me, threatening to unravel the fragile threads of my carefully constructed facade. But then she smiles, a small knowing smile that sends a shiver down my spine. Does she recognize me? Does she even understand the depths of my obsession, the lengths to which I've gone to remain hidden in plain sight? Or is it merely a trick of the light, a figment of my fevered imagination? I drew back from the window, retreating into the darkness of my own apartment. The weight of my guilt settles heavily on my shoulders. I know that what I'm doing is wrong, that my fixation on her is unhealthy and dangerous. Yet, I find myself drawn back to the window, drawn back to the quiet sanctuary of apartment 3B. For in those stolen moments of observation, I catch fleeting glimpses of a life that I can never truly be a part of. A life that only exists beyond the confines of my own fractured reality. And so I continue to watch, to wait, to yearn for a connection that may never come. For in the end, I'm nothing more than the watcher in the shadows, forever bound to the object of my obsession by the invisible threads of desire and regret. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.